Her skin was like nothing I had ever known, smoother than the pages of the old books she loved so much, and warm, so incredibly warm, under my trembling hands. The moonlight spilling through her bedroom window was cruel, painting our tangled bodies in silver and shadow, turning a professor's respectable home into a den of sin. Her scent was a dizzying mix of night-blooming jasmine and the dark, rich red wine we had been drinking, an aroma that has clung to the edges of my memory for years. Her whispers were fractured, a battle fought and lost in the space between each breath. Liam, we shouldn't. My God, this is insane. But her words were betrayed by the arch of her back, by the way her fingers dug into my shoulders, pulling me closer, deeper. I was 19, a boy playing a man's game with no understanding of the rules, and she was my literature professor, Dr. Eleanor Vance. Her lips, which had once spoken so eloquently of poetic tragedy, were now whispering my name in a cadence of pure, unadulterated pleasure, a sound that both thrilled and terrified me. That night, she was not a scholar in a tweed jacket, but a woman unraveling, and in her surrender, she took my innocence with her. That memory always ends there, cutting off just before the dawn, before the shame could fully take root. Even now, years later, on a night like this, with the rain streaking down my apartment window, it comes back uninvited. It feels less like a memory and more like a ghost that sits in the chair across from me. Her name was Dr. Eleanor Vance, and she taught me more about life, lust, and loss than any book on her syllabus ever could. It all began during my sophomore year at Northwood University, a time that was supposed to be about finding myself, about late-night study sessions and football games. A time that was supposed to be about Chloe, my girlfriend, the girl I was supposed to love with a simple, uncomplicated heart. But nothing was simple after I walked into Professor Vance's lecture hall. Nothing would ever be simple again. The lecture hall felt like a tomb that first day, a cavern of dark wood and dusty light where young minds were meant to be filled, but more often than not, were simply lulled to sleep. I found a seat somewhere in the middle, surrounded by the usual collegiate chatter, the talk of weekend parties and impossible assignments. Chloe had texted me good luck, a simple, sweet message with a heart emoji that now feels like a relic from another lifetime. I was just another student, in just another required literature course, expecting another semester taught by a monotone professor who had long ago lost their passion. The air was thick with indifference. And then, she walked in. The room didn't fall silent in a dramatic, cinematic way. Instead, a slow, rolling quiet took over as she moved to the lectern, a gradual recognition that the person who had just entered was not what anyone had expected. She placed a worn leather satchel on the desk, its surface softened by years of use, and for a moment she just looked at us. Her name, written on the syllabus projected onto the screen behind her, was Dr. Eleanor Vance. The name itself felt like poetry. She wasn't beautiful in the way a magazine cover is beautiful. Her features were too sharp for that, her eyes too intelligent to be merely pretty. She wore a simple gray dress, elegant and understated, and a single silver bracelet that caught the light when she moved her wrist. Her dark hair was pulled back, but a few rebellious strands had escaped, framing a face that seemed to hold a quiet, deep-seated weariness, a knowledge of the world that both intimidated and fascinated me. When she began to speak, her voice was the first spell she cast. It wasn't loud, but it filled the cavernous room completely. It was a low, melodic voice, each word carefully chosen, each sentence perfectly formed, as if she were reading from a novel only she had access to. "Good morning," she said, and the simple greeting felt profound. "In this class, we will not be dissecting poetry. We will not be killing it to see what makes it work. We will be learning how to listen to it, how to let it live inside of us." I stopped fidgeting with my pen. Around me, the low hum of distractions ceased. We were all listening. Her first lecture was on John Keats, specifically his Ode to a Nightingale. She didn't read it from the page in a robotic drone. She stepped away from the lectern, her hands moving with a fluid grace as she spoke, and she recited the first stanza from memory. Her eyes were slightly closed, as if she were seeing the words in the air in front of her. My heart aches, and a drowsy numbness pains my sense, as though of hemlock I had drunk. The words, which had felt so distant and academic when I'd read them the night before, were suddenly alive, visceral, I could feel the ache, the numbness. She made us feel it. She spoke of Keats's short, tragic life, not as a series of biographical facts, but as the fuel for his desperate, beautiful art. She connected his longing for escape, for a world without pain, to our own modern anxieties, to the nights we all feel overwhelmed and wish we could simply fade far away, dissolve, and quite forget. I found myself leaning forward, my notebook open but completely blank. I wasn't a student anymore. I was an audience of one. I watched the way her fingers would trace the edge of a book as she made a point, the way she would pause, searching for the perfect word, her brow furrowed in concentration. It was in those pauses that I felt the first real pull, the dangerous curiosity. This wasn't a performance for her. It was a passion. She was sharing a piece of her soul with us through the words of a long-dead poet. At one point, as she was describing the idea of beauty and truth, her eyes scanned the room, and for a single, heart-stopping second, they met mine. It wasn't a flirtatious glance. It was something more intense, a look of pure, intellectual engagement, as if she could see that I wasn't just hearing her, but that I was truly listening. The connection was electric, a current that shot through the mundane air of the classroom and jolted me awake. In that second, the 30 other students in the room vanished. It was just her and me, sharing a secret understanding of a beautiful line of poetry. Then, just as quickly, her gaze moved on, but I was left breathless, my heart hammering against my ribs. I started to notice things I shouldn't have. I saw the faint, almost invisible white scar near her hairline. I saw the way her smile, when it briefly appeared, didn't quite reach the sad wisdom in her eyes. I wondered about the man who had put a ring on her finger, a simple gold band she twisted absently when she was deep in thought. Did he appreciate the mind that was currently holding an entire lecture hall captive? Did he understand the depths of the woman who could make a 200-year-old poem feel like a personal confession? The sound of the bell was a violence. It shattered the world she had built, and the room was once again filled with the scraping of chairs and the loud chatter of students eager to escape. She simply nodded, a quiet dismissal. "Read Shelley for Wednesday," she said, her voice now back to a teacher's cadence, the spell broken. But it wasn't broken for me. I gathered my things in a daze, my mind still replaying her words, the sound of her voice, the fleeting moment our eyes had met. As I walked out of the lecture hall and into the bright, indifferent afternoon sun, the world felt different. The other students, with their talk of trivial things, seemed like children. I felt older, as if I had been let in on a profound secret. I knew with a certainty that was both exhilarating and terrifying that I would not be missing a single second of this class. I knew I had to find a reason, any reason, to talk to her, to hear that voice directed only at me. The admiration was no longer just academic. It was something deeper, something more personal. It was the beginning of an obsession, a slow, intellectual seduction that had already taken root deep inside me. I was completely, utterly, and irrevocably captivated by Dr. Eleanor Vance. Her office was on the 4th floor of the Humanities building, tucked away at the end of a long, quiet corridor that smelled of floor wax and decaying paper. For a week after that first lecture, I wrestled with the idea of going to her office hours. The syllabus said Tuesdays and Thursdays, from 2 to 4. It was an open invitation, a professional obligation, but to me, it felt like a locked door. I needed a secret key to open. What would I even say? My questions about Shelley felt flimsy, manufactured excuses to simply be in her presence again. I was terrified she would see right through me, that she would peg me as just another student with a crush and dismiss me with a polite, professional smile. The thought was humiliating, but the thought of not going, of letting that fragile electric connection from the lecture hall simply fade away, was even worse. So, on a Tuesday afternoon, with my heart beating a nervous rhythm against my ribs, I found myself standing in front of her door. The nameplate was simple brass, Dr. E. Vance. I took a breath and knocked. Her voice, muffled from inside, said, "Come in." The room was exactly as I had hoped it would be. It wasn't a sterile academic cube. It was a small, cluttered haven, a fortress built of books. They were everywhere, stacked high on shelves that bowed under their weight, piled on the floor, spilling from her desk. The air smelled of aged paper, brewed tea, and that same faint jasmine perfume I remembered from the lecture hall, only stronger here, more intimate. She was sitting at her desk, bathed in the soft light from the single, large window that looked out over the campus quad. She had reading glasses perched on her nose, and she looked up, a flicker of recognition in her eyes. "Liam, is it?" she asked. My name on her lips sent a ridiculous jolt through me. I just nodded, clutching my copy of Shelley like a shield. I had a question about Ozymandias's," I stammered, the lie feeling clumsy and obvious in my mouth. She smiled, a small, genuine smile that made the lines around her eyes crinkle. "Of course," she said, gesturing to the worn armchair opposite her desk. "Please." That first conversation was stiff, at least on my part. I asked my prepared question, something about the poem's theme of transient power, and she answered it with the same effortless brilliance she displayed in her lectures. But then, instead of letting the conversation die, she leaned back in her chair, removing her glasses and gently rubbing the bridge of her nose. It was such a human, unguarded gesture. "But what do you think?" she asked. "Does art really outlast empires? Or is that just a pretty lie poets tell themselves to feel important?" The question caught me off guard. She wasn't testing me. She was genuinely asking for my opinion. And so, we talked, for nearly an hour. We forgot about the syllabus and the ticking clock. We talked about art and ego, about the desire for immortality, about whether a single poem could truly change the world. It was the most exhilarating conversation of my life. I left her office that day feeling 10 feet tall. That first visit broke the dam. I became a regular, a fixture in that worn armchair every Tuesday. The academic pretenses quickly fell away. We both knew I wasn't there to discuss footnotes or meter. I was there for the conversation. I was there for her. Our discussions became a sprawling, intimate tapestry, weaving from literature into life and back again. We'd start with Wordsworth's view of nature and end up talking about my childhood camping trips in Maine. We'd analyze the tragic heroines of Shakespeare, and it would somehow lead to her mentioning, with a wry, sad smile, that she had once wanted to be an actress. I was learning the geography of her mind, the contours of her soul. In that small office, she wasn't the formidable Dr. Vance. She was Eleanor. I saw the vulnerability she kept so carefully hidden from the world. One afternoon, while discussing the stifling social conventions in Jane Austen's novels, she let out a small, weary sigh and stared out the window for a long moment. "Sometimes I think society hasn't changed all that much," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "We just have different kinds of gilded cages." She didn't elaborate, but I knew she wasn't talking about the book anymore. I saw a framed photograph on her desk I had noticed before, a picture of her and a handsome, square-jawed man standing on a sailboat. They were both smiling, but his arm was loosely, almost carelessly, draped around her shoulder. He looked like a man who owned things, a man who possessed a beautiful wife in the same way he possessed a beautiful boat. I looked from the photo back to her tired eyes, and I felt a surge of something fierce and protective. He didn't see her, not the way I did. My obsession grew with every visit. I was an archaeologist, carefully dusting off the artifacts of her life. I learned she drank her tea black with one sugar. I learned she hated the winter but loved the first snow. I learned her silver bracelet was a gift from her grandmother. I began to feel that this little office was my space as much as hers, a secret world we had created, separate from the rest of the university, separate from her marriage, separate from my relationship with Chloe. The thought of Chloe would surface now and then, a pang of guilt that I would quickly push aside. The hours I spent with Eleanor felt more real, more vital than the time I spent with anyone else. The line between professor and student had vanished. I was no longer intimidated by her. I was enchanted. The intellectual connection had become deeply emotional. We would sit there, the space between us charged with unspoken things, our knees sometimes only inches apart. The air would grow thick with the things we couldn't say, the boundaries we both knew we were dangerously close to crossing. One late Thursday afternoon, as the sun was setting and casting long shadows across her office, we were talking about a particularly bleak poem. I confess that it sometimes made me feel hopeless about the world. She looked at me, her gaze steady and serious, and there was a warmth in her eyes I had never seen before. "Don't ever let the darkness win, Liam," she said softly. "The world needs sensitive souls like yours." The way she said my name, the weight she gave it, made it sound like a caress. The conversation lulled, and a comfortable silence settled between us. It was time for me to go. As I stood up, gathering my books, I felt a strange reluctance to leave. She looked up at me from her chair. "Thank you for these talks," she said, and her voice was laced with a sincerity that struck me to my core. It's nice to talk to someone who actually understands." That was it. That was the moment. She wasn't just my professor anymore. I wasn't just her student. We were two lonely people who had found a brief, precious solace in a room full of books. I walked out of her office that evening not with the thrill of a crush, but with the profound, earth-shattering feeling of being seen, of being needed. The emotional affair had been consecrated, and I knew, with a terrifying and absolute certainty, that I would do anything, cross any line, to keep that feeling alive. The university advertised it as an evening with poet laureate Alistair Finch, but for me, it was an evening where I might see her. The event was held in the Atherton Library's grand reading room, a place of hushed reverence with soaring vaulted ceilings, stained glass windows, and the intoxicating smell of aging leather and wood smoke from the massive fireplace. I went alone. Chloe had wanted to go to a movie, but I made up some excuse about needing to study. The lie felt slick and easy on my tongue, a skill I was unfortunately honing. I wasn't there for Alistair Finch. I was a hunter, and my prey was a glimpse of Eleanor outside the confines of her office. I scanned the room, a sea of tweed jackets and thoughtful expressions, and then I saw her. She was standing near the fireplace, talking to the dean, holding a wine glass with an elegance that seemed as natural to her as breathing. My own breath caught in my throat. She wasn't Dr. Vance tonight. She was wearing a dark blue dress that fell just below her knees, a simple, fluid garment that made her look less like an academic and more like the heroine of a French film. Her hair, which she usually kept pinned up, was down, falling in soft, dark waves around her shoulders. She laughed at something the dean said, and the sound was low and rich, a startlingly beautiful note in the quiet room. I felt a possessive pang, a completely irrational jealousy of the man who could make her laugh like that. I took a seat in the back, my eyes fixed on her, a secret observer in the shadows. During the reading, I barely heard the words of the celebrated poet. My entire consciousness was focused on her. I watched the way the firelight flickered across her face, catching in the strands of her dark hair. I watched her nod slightly at a particularly poignant line, her lips curved in a small, knowing smile. It felt as if we were the only two people in the room truly understanding the poet's lament for a lost love, that we were sharing the experience across the crowded space through some invisible, telepathic thread. When the reading ended and polite applause filled the room, I felt a knot of anxiety tighten in my stomach. This was my chance. People began to mingle, and I navigated the crowd with a feigned nonchalance, my path a carefully calculated trajectory toward her. "Dr. Vance," I said, my voice sounding more confident than I felt. She turned, and a genuine smile lit up her face when she saw me. "Liam, I'm surprised to see you here. I didn't take you for a fan of Finch's later work." "I'm a fan of any work you recommend," I replied, and the words hung in the air, heavier than I intended. A faint blush rose on her cheeks. We spoke for a few minutes about the poetry, the usual safe academic talk, but the context was entirely different. We weren't professor and student. We were a man and a woman, standing close in a dimly lit room, the scent of her perfume, a subtle, intoxicating cloud around her. As the crowd began to thin, a natural pause fell between us. "Well," she said, "I should probably be heading home. I'll walk with you, if you don't mind," I offered quickly. "It's on my way." It wasn't, but I would have walked to the edge of the world if she had asked. "I'd like that," she said softly. We stepped out of the library and into the crisp October night. The campus was deserted, bathed in the golden glow of old-fashioned lampposts. The sound of our footsteps crunching on the fallen leaves was the only sound. The silence felt comfortable at first, but it slowly grew thick with unspoken words. "Did you enjoy the reading?" I asked, just to break the spell. She was quiet for a moment, then sighed. "I did. But it makes me a little sad." "Why?" I asked. She looked up at the canopy of black, leafless branches against the starry sky. "All that passion, all that feeling, it's a beautiful thing to witness. It just reminds me of how quiet life can get sometimes." Her voice was filled with that familiar, haunting melancholy. "My husband, Mark," she continued, her gaze still fixed on the sky. "He was supposed to join me tonight. An important client called. There's always an important client. It wasn't a complaint, but a statement of fact, delivered with a resignation that was more heartbreaking than any angry tirade. He doesn't understand things like this. Poetry. He thinks it's impractical." We stopped walking, coming to a halt under the sprawling branches of a giant ancient oak tree at the center of the main quad. There was no one else around. It felt like we were on a stage, lit by a single lamppost. She finally turned her head to look at me, and in the soft, forgiving light, she looked younger, more vulnerable than I had ever seen her. "I feel like I live my life in a language he doesn't speak," she confessed, her voice barely audible. My heart ached for her. All my carefully constructed arguments, all my guilt about Chloe, it all evaporated in that moment. All I wanted to do was erase the sadness from her eyes. The space between us crackled with a sudden, intense energy. I could smell the faint scent of wine on her breath, see the subtle rise and fall of her chest. The intellectual admiration I'd felt for weeks had finally, fully, morphed into a raw, undeniable physical need. I wanted to kiss her. The urge was so powerful, it was like a physical force, pulling me forward. I raised my hand, my mind, a blank slate of pure instinct. I told myself I was just going to brush a stray leaf from the shoulder of her dress, but we both knew it was a lie. As my fingers grazed the fabric of her sleeve, her breath hitched. Her eyes, wide and dark, were locked on mine. The world narrowed to the few inches between us. I saw her sway, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement toward me. This was it. The boundary was about to turn to dust. Time itself seemed to stop, holding its breath. And then, the piercing sound of a siren wailed in the distance, a harsh, ugly tear in the fabric of our perfect moment. The spell was shattered. Eleanor blinked, taking a small, sharp step back. The warmth vanished from her eyes, replaced by a flicker of panic. "It's late," she said, her voice suddenly formal, strained. "I should go." She didn't wait for my reply. She just turned and walked away quickly, her heels clicking on the stone path, the sound echoing in the sudden, deafening silence. I stood there under the oak tree, my hand still half raised, my fingers tingling where they had almost touched her. I watched her until she disappeared into the shadows, a fleeting shape in the night. I walked back to my dorm room in a state of torment and exhilaration. The intellectual game was over. The polite conversations, the safe distance, it was all gone now. We had stood on the edge of the cliff together, and we had both looked down. We could no longer pretend we didn't know what was there. The near touch was more intimate than any kiss could have been. It was a promise. It was a threat. And I knew, as I lay awake in my bed for hours, that it was only a matter of time before one of us found the courage to jump. The week after the poetry night was an agony of silence. I saw her in class, of course, but the easy intimacy of her office was gone, replaced by a careful professional distance. She wouldn't meet my eye. I felt a gnawing fear that I had ruined everything, that our moment under the oak tree had terrified her back into her fortress. Then, on Tuesday, I stayed after class, my heart a cold stone in my chest, determined to say something, anything. But before I could speak, she looked up from her satchel, her expression unreadable. "Liam," she said, her voice low and steady, "I have a favor to ask, if you have the time." My heart leaped. "Anything," I said, perhaps too quickly. She explained that she was trying to clear out some old academic books from her home office, boxes and boxes of them that needed to be sorted for donation. "My husband Mark is in London for the rest of the week," she said, letting the words hang in the air with deliberate weight. "And I'm afraid the task is a bit much for me alone. Would you be willing to help? I could pay you for your time, of course." The offer of money was a flimsy, transparent veil, a way to legitimize the request. We both knew she wasn't asking for a student employee. She was issuing an invitation. "I don't want any money," I said, my voice hoarse. "When should I come?" Driving to her house that Saturday felt surreal. She lived in a neighborhood of large, stately homes with manicured lawns and long, sweeping driveways. It was a world away from my cramped dorm room. Her house was a beautiful, modern structure of glass and dark wood, a piece of architectural art that looked like it had been lifted from a magazine. It was stunning, but there was a coldness to it, a sterile perfection that felt unwelcoming. It didn't look like a home, it looked like a statement. I parked my beat-up sedan behind her sleek, dark SUV and walked to the front door, my palms sweating. She answered before I could knock, as if she had been waiting, and the sight of her made the air leave my lungs. She was not Dr. Vance, the elegant professor, or Eleanor, the woman in the blue dress. This was someone else entirely. She was wearing a simple, soft-looking cashmere sweater, the color of oatmeal, and a pair of black leggings that clung to the long, graceful lines of her legs. Her hair was gathered in a messy, careless knot on top of her head, and her face was free of makeup. She was barefoot. She looked real. She looked like a woman in her own home on a Saturday morning, and it was the most devastatingly intimate thing I had ever seen. "Hi," she said, her voice a little breathless. "Come in." The inside of the house was just like the outside. Impeccably designed, minimalist, and deeply impersonal. The furniture was expensive and uncomfortable looking. The walls were adorned with abstract art that felt chosen by a decorator, not a person. There were no cozy signs of life, no clutter, no stray papers, no stacks of magazines. It was Mark's house, I realized. It was his taste, his money, his sterile world. It felt like the polar opposite of her office, that warm, chaotic nest of books and ideas. Her study was the only room that felt like her. It was smaller than the other rooms, but it was crammed with books, just like her office, a pocket of passionate disorder in the midst of all that cold perfection. "Here's the disaster zone," she said with a small laugh, gesturing to several large, overflowing boxes. For the next few hours, we worked. We fell into an easy, domestic rhythm, lifting boxes, sorting hardcovers from paperbacks, creating piles for donation and piles to keep. The work itself was mundane, but the context made every moment charged with electricity. We were in her private space, her husband's name, an unspoken ghost in the room. Our bodies were constantly in close proximity, in the cramped space. Her shoulder would brush against my arm as she reached for a book. Our fingers would touch as I passed a heavy volume to her. Each accidental contact was a small explosion on my skin. The air grew thick with a tension that was far more potent than the smell of old paper. Our conversation was a delicate dance. We talked about the books, about the authors we loved and the ones we loathed. It was safe territory, but the subtext was a raging river beneath the surface. At one point, I pulled out a thin, worn volume of Pablo Neruda's love sonnets. Tucked inside was a pressed, faded daisy. "This is beautiful," I said, holding it out to her. She took it, her expression softening into something wistful. "A boy gave me that in college," she said quietly. "He told me I was his unattainable Beatrice." She smiled a sad, fleeting smile. "I married a practical man instead." She didn't say it with regret, but with the simple, detached clarity of a historian stating a fact. She placed the book on the keep pile. I found myself watching the muscles in her back as she stretched to place a book on a high shelf, the way the soft knit of her sweater pulled taut across her shoulders. I watched the way she bit her lower lip when she was concentrating. I was memorizing a version of her that no one else at the university would ever see, and the thought was a secret, selfish thrill. By late afternoon, the sun was casting long, golden bars of light through the study window. The last box was sorted. A sudden, awkward silence fell between us. The reason for my being there was over. This was the moment I was supposed to thank her and leave, to retreat back to my world, and she to hers. I could feel the invisible professional boundary trying to reassert itself, a flimsy wall against the tide of everything that had passed between us. I stood there, my hands feeling useless at my sides, my heart pounding. I couldn't bring myself to say goodbye. She looked at me, her eyes dark and searching in the dimming light. The silence stretched on, a taut wire of possibility. Then she broke it. "I was about to open a bottle of wine," she said, her voice low and even, but I could hear the tremor beneath it. "To celebrate a job well done. Would you like to join me for a glass?" It wasn't a question. It was a confession. It was an admission that she didn't want me to leave any more than I wanted to go. It was the final, deliberate step across the line we had been circling for weeks. The temptation was no longer a distant possibility. It was here, in this silent house, in the form of a simple glass of wine, and I was not nearly strong enough to refuse. "Yes," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I'd like that very much." I had accepted the invitation. I had stepped through the door, and I knew with a terrifying certainty that I would not be leaving her house that night. She led me into the living room, a vast, cavernous space with a wall of windows that was now a black mirror, reflecting the soft glow of the single lamp she switched on. The room was beautiful, sterile, and felt completely unused. She retrieved a bottle of Cabernet from a sleek wine cooler and uncorked it with practiced hands, the small pop echoing in the silence. She handed me a glass, her fingers brushing against mine, a deliberate, lingering touch that sent a tremor through my entire body. We sat on a large, white sofa, not too close but not far enough apart to feel casual. The wine was dark and smooth, and its warmth spread through my chest, emboldening me. For a while, we just sipped in silence, the air thick with anticipation. "So," she finally said, her voice a low murmur, "an unattainable Beatrice. That's quite a thing to be called." "I think he was right," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. She looked at me over the rim of her glass, her dark eyes searching my face. "You don't know me, Liam." "I feel like I do," I confessed, the wine making me reckless. "I feel like I see you. More than he does, anyway." I glanced at the wedding photo on the mantelpiece, the one I had seen in her office. Her gaze followed mine, and a shadow passed over her features. "Mark is a good man," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "He's just busy. We live in different worlds, even when we're in the same house." She took a deep swallow of wine. "Sometimes, the loneliness is so loud it feels like a scream." There it was, the confession I had been waiting for, the raw, unguarded truth. I put my glass down on the cold marble coffee table and reached out, covering her hand with mine. Her skin was cool, and she flinched for a split second before relaxing, turning her hand over and lacing her fingers through mine. We sat like that for a long moment, our hands clasped, a silent, binding contract. I could feel the delicate bones in her hand, the warmth of her pulse. I slid closer on the sofa, my entire body humming, every nerve ending on fire. I could smell the jasmine of her perfume, the womanly scent of her skin. "Eleanor," I whispered, the name feeling both foreign and perfectly natural on my lips. She turned her head, and her face was just inches from mine. I could see the conflict in her eyes, the war between desire and reason, and I saw desire winning. I leaned in and kissed her. The first touch of our lips was soft, hesitant, a question, and then she answered. She let out a small, broken sound, a sigh of surrender, and kissed me back. All the pent-up longing, all the weeks of stolen glances and charged conversations exploded in that single moment. The kiss deepened, becoming hungry, desperate. It tasted of wine and sadness and a need so profound it felt like starvation. Her hands came up to cup my face, her fingers tangling in my hair, pulling me closer still. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathless. She rested her forehead against mine, her eyes closed. "Liam," she whispered, her voice trembling, "we shouldn't. God, this is insane." I know, I breathed back, my lips brushing against hers. "But I can't stop. I haven't been able to think about anything else since the first day I saw you." She didn't argue. She didn't pull away. Instead, she stood up, her hand still holding mine, and she began to lead me out of the living room, down the long, silent hallway. I followed, my heart hammering, my mind a whirlwind of disbelief and pure, animal want. She led me into her bedroom. It was as immaculate as the rest of the house, dominated by a huge bed with a crisp white duvet. This was the heart of the transgression, her husband's bed. The thought should have terrified me, but it only heightened the illicit thrill. She turned to face me in the dim light filtering in from the hallway, and slowly, she reached up and pulled the pins from her hair. It cascaded down over her shoulders in a wave of dark silk. Then, she took the hem of her cashmere sweater in both hands and pulled it over her head. My breath hitched. She was wearing a simple black lace bra that did little to contain the heavy fullness of her breasts. For a moment, I could only stare. A 19-year-old boy witnessing a beauty I had only ever read about in books. Those weren't breasts. They were a work of art, a pair of perfect, snowy pears that seemed to glow in the dim light. She saw the awe on my face, and a small, confident smile played on her lips. She unhooked the bra and let it fall to the floor. "Don't just stand there, Liam," she whispered, her voice husky. I moved toward her as if in a trance, my hands clumsy as I fumbled with the buttons on my own shirt. Our clothes came off in a heap on the floor, and then we were skin to skin, falling onto the cool, clean sheets of the bed. Her body was a revelation. The softness of her stomach, the elegant curve of her hips, the surprising strength in her legs as she wrapped them around me. I was exploring a new continent. "You're trembling," she whispered, her hands stroking my back, calming me. "It's okay. It's your first time, isn't it?" I could only nod, a blush creeping up my neck. "Then let me teach you," she said, and her lips found mine again. What followed was a blur of sensation, a lesson in pleasure taught by a master. Every touch was both a discovery and a seduction. My initial clumsiness was met with her patient, guiding hands. She showed me how to touch her, where to kiss her, how to listen to the language of her body. Her initial whispered protests of "Don't, Liam, we can't," soon melted away, replaced by gasps and moans that were music to my ears. I discovered the sensitive skin behind her ear, the hollow of her throat. I buried my face in her hair, drunk on her scent. My mouth found its way down her neck, across her collarbone, to the heavy, perfect globes of her breasts. The moment my lips closed over her nipple, she cried out, a sharp, involuntary sound arching her back. "Oh God, yes, right there, Liam. Please." The sound drove me wild. The last vestiges of the boy I had been were burned away in the fire of that moment. There was no thought, no guilt, only a primal, overwhelming need to be closer, to be inside her. As I finally pushed into her, she let out a long, shuddering moan, her nails digging into my back. Deeper. "Please, Liam. Deeper." "Ah, yes. More." We moved together, a frantic, desperate rhythm, a collision of loneliness and long-suppressed desire. It was messy and beautiful and perfect. Her sounds filled the silent, sterile house, a defiant cry of life in the museum her husband had built. In the final moments, she threw her head back, her body convulsing around me, crying out my name in a series of shuddering gasps. "Oh, Liam, ah!" Her release triggered my own, a tidal wave of sensation that washed away everything. Afterward, we lay tangled in the sheets, our bodies slick with sweat, the sound of our ragged breathing slowly returning to normal in the cavernous silence of the bedroom. My arm was draped over her, my head resting on her shoulder. I could feel the frantic, steady beat of her heart against my cheek. The passion had passed, leaving in its wake a profound, terrifying intimacy. We had done it. We had crossed the line. Lying there in the darkness, in her husband's bed, I felt the first cold tendril of what was to come. The guilt, the lies, the consequences. But in that moment, all I could feel was the warmth of her skin against mine, and the overwhelming, life-altering knowledge that I was no longer a boy. And she, my beautiful, tragic professor, had been my teacher to the very end. I woke to the unfamiliar sight of pale morning light, filtering through vertical blinds, striping the white duvet in bars of gray and gold. For a disoriented moment, I didn't know where I was. The room was silent, the air still and cool. Then, the scent of her reached me, the ghost of jasmine on the pillow, the warm, clean scent of her skin next to me, and the memory of the night before crashed over me, not as a gentle wave, but as a tidal force. My whole body ached in a way that was both painful and deeply satisfying. I turned my head slowly. Eleanor was still asleep, lying on her side, facing me. In sleep, the formidable professor was gone. The weary, beautiful woman was gone. She looked younger, softer, her face free from the tension and intellect that usually guarded it. One arm was tucked under her pillow, her dark hair a chaotic spill across the white linen. I felt a surge of incredible tenderness, a fierce protective instinct that was terrifying in its intensity. I wanted to memorize every detail of her face, to burn this image into my mind. This was a secret, a treasure that was mine alone. But as the sun climbed higher, the golden light hardened into the unforgiving glare of day, and the magic began to curdle. I was lying in another man's bed. The sleek, impersonal furniture, the expensive watch on the nightstand beside a book on corporate law, it all belonged to him. I was an intruder, a thief who had stolen something precious in the dead of night. She stirred, a soft murmur escaping her lips, before her eyes fluttered open. For a split second, as she focused on me, her expression was open, soft with sleep. Then, recognition dawned, and a mask of cool panic snapped into place. She sat up abruptly, pulling the sheet up to cover herself. The easy, languid intimacy of our bodies just moments before was gone, replaced by a chasm of awkwardness. "Good morning," I said, my voice a rough croak. "What time is it?" she asked, her voice tight, avoiding my gaze as she looked for the clock. It wasn't a question. It was a deflection, a desperate grasp for normalcy. The silence that followed was deafening, filled with the unspoken weight of what we had done. The night had been a fantasy, a fever dream. The morning was the consequence. I saw my jeans slung over a chair, and on top of them, my phone. The screen was dark, but I knew with a sickening certainty what would be on it. My hand trembled slightly as I reached for it. 3 missed calls from Chloe, 5 texts. "Hey, where were you last night? Study session run late. Getting worried, call me when you get this. Liam, is everything okay? Just wanted to hear your voice. Love you." Each word was a punch to the gut. Love you. The simple, innocent phrase felt like an accusation, a judgment from a world I no longer felt a part of. I felt a wave of self-loathing so intense it made me dizzy. Who was I? I was a liar, a cheat. I had shattered something pure for a few hours of forbidden pleasure. I got out of bed, pulling on my clothes with fumbling, clumsy movements, feeling her eyes on my back. When I turned back to face her, she was wrapped in a silk robe, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She looked like a general surveying a battlefield. "We need to talk," she said, her voice stripped of all its previous warmth. We ended up in the kitchen, a gleaming stainless steel and marble affair that felt more like a laboratory than a place where people ate. She made coffee with brisk, efficient movements, the clatter of the ceramic mugs the only sound. She didn't look at me. She placed a cup in front of me, her own held in both hands like a shield. "Liam," she began, her gaze fixed on the steam rising from her coffee. Last night was a mistake. A terrible, inexcusable mistake. The words were cold, clinical. It felt like she was talking about a failed experiment. "It didn't feel like a mistake," I said, my voice quiet, pleading. I don't care how it felt." She cut me off, her eyes finally flashing with a spark of emotion. Not passion, but fear. "Do you have any idea what would happen if anyone found out? I would lose everything. My job, my marriage, my entire life. And for what? A moment of foolishness." The word foolishness stung. She was already rewriting the narrative, reducing what felt like a monumental, life-altering event for me into a simple lapse in judgment for her. "So that's all it was to you?" I asked, the hurt evident in my voice. She sighed, her shoulders slumping, the fear in her eyes softening for a moment into something that looked like regret. "No," she admitted, her voice dropping. "It wasn't just that, and you know it. But that's what it has to be. That's the only way we can survive this." She leaned forward, her expression intense, her voice a low, urgent whisper. "So here are the rules. Last night never happened. We will never speak of it. Not to each other, not to anyone. Ever. In the classroom, I am your professor. You are my student. Nothing more. Our conversations in my office will be strictly about the coursework. No more personal discussions. No more late afternoons. We cannot see each other outside of the university. Ever. Do you understand? She was building a wall between us, brick by painful brick. Every rule was a rejection, a denial of the connection I felt so deeply. But I saw the desperation in her eyes, and I knew she was doing it as much to protect herself as to push me away. If these were the terms for keeping her in my life, even in a fractured, clandestine way, I would accept them. I was a drowning man, and she was offering me a single, ragged breath. I understand, I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. Good, she said, leaning back, the mask of control firmly in place once more. Now, I think you should go. The goodbye was as cold and sterile as the kitchen. There was no kiss, no lingering touch. She just walked me to the front door and opened it. The bright, ordinary Saturday morning felt like an assault. I stepped out onto the porch, and for a moment, I turned back, hoping for one last glance, one small sign of the woman who had cried out my name in the dark. But her face was a careful, neutral blank. She closed the door, the soft click of the lock, a sound of absolute finality. The walk back to my car was the longest walk of my life. I felt like a ghost, an alien visiting a world I didn't belong to. The beautiful, perfect house looked like a prison. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw a flicker of movement in the upstairs window, a silhouette standing behind the blinds. Then it was gone. Back in my dorm room, the familiar posters on the wall, the messy pile of textbooks, the smallness of it all, felt suffocating. My world had shrunk. I picked up a framed photo of Chloe from my desk, a picture of us from the previous summer, both of us tanned, smiling, impossibly young and carefree. Her smile was so open, so full of trust, and I had betrayed it. I had betrayed her. The affair had officially begun, not with a passionate kiss, but with a cold, hard pact of silence and lies. The secret was now a living thing, a parasite that had taken root inside me, and I knew, as I stared into Chloe's trusting eyes, that it was going to eat me alive. The rules Eleanor had laid out in her cold, sunlit kitchen were supposed to be our new reality, a fortress of professionalism to keep us safe from ourselves. In practice, they became a form of exquisite torture. In her lecture hall, I would sit in the back, tracing the line of her shoulder beneath her blazer, remembering the feel of her skin. She would stand at the lectern, discussing the romantic agony of Percy Shelley, and her eyes would sweep across the room, deliberately avoiding mine, a denial that was so potent it felt like a touch. The tension was a third person in the room, a living, breathing entity that only the two of us could see. Our office hours were the worst. We would sit across her desk, a stack of my essays between us, and she would critique my writing with a detached, clinical precision, her voice never wavering. But I would watch the pulse beating in her throat, the way she would twist the gold band on her finger, and I knew she felt it too. The rules were a lie, and we were both suffocating under the weight of them. It took exactly 10 days for the fortress to crumble. An email appeared in my student inbox late one night. The subject line was blank. The body contained a single sentence. Farley Hill parking lot. Behind the old observatory. 10 minutes. There was no name, but none was needed. Farley Hill was a place students went to drink cheap beer and look at the stars. At this time of night, in the middle of the week, it was deserted. A light, miserable rain was falling, blurring the campus lights into a watercolor smear. I found her car, a dark, anonymous SUV, parked in the deepest shadow. The moment I got in, the car was filled with the scent of her, and all my resolve, all my guilt evaporated. She didn't say a word. She just leaned across the console and kissed me, a desperate, hungry kiss that tasted of rain and want. This was nothing like our first time, with its slow, hesitant discovery. This was a raw, frantic collision. The rules, the risk, the suppression, it had all acted as a pressure cooker, and this was the violent release. I'm sorry, she breathed against my lips. I just couldn't stay away. Me neither, I gasped, my hands fumbling with the buttons of her coat. needing to feel her skin. Our encounters took on this desperate, clandestine rhythm. We never went back to her house. It was too dangerous, too intimate. Instead, we became creatures of the shadows, seeking out the forgotten liminal spaces of the world. Her car, parked in dark, wooded lanes. An empty classroom in the arts building late at night. Once, terrifyingly, in a single-stall restroom in a library she knew was never used. These weren't romantic trysts. They were frantic, almost violent acts of mutual need. The passion was heightened by the sordidness of it all, the constant, humming fear of a flashlight beam, of a passing car, of a janitor's key in the lock. I remember one night in particular, parked again behind the observatory, with a storm raging outside. The rain was hammering on the roof of the car, a relentless, deafening drum that matched the beating of my own heart. The windows were completely fogged over, sealing us in our own private, steamy world. She had pushed my seat back and was straddling me, her skirt hiked up around her waist, the silhouette of her body, a dark, powerful shape against the flashes of lightning. She was in control, moving with a fierce, demanding rhythm that left me breathless. "Is this what you want, Liam?" she breathed, her hair falling around my face. "Tell me." "Yes," I gasped, my hands gripping her hips, the soft flesh of her thighs. "Harder, Eleanor. Please, don't stop." Her own polite academic language was gone, replaced by the guttural, universal language of desire. Her quiet moans became sharp cries that were swallowed by the storm. It was pure, unadulterated lust, a desperate attempt to feel something, anything, in the quiet emptiness of her life, and a brutal, selfish confirmation for me that I was a man. It was the most thrilling, alive, and utterly degrading experience of my life. And then, it would be over. I would pull my clothes back on, my body still humming, and drive back to campus, back to my real life. And the whiplash would nearly break me. An hour after that raging storm in her car, I was sitting with Chloe in a brightly lit, sterile-smelling frozen yogurt shop. She was telling me about her day, about a funny thing her biology professor had said. She was so bright, so good, so completely unaware of the filth I felt was clinging to my skin. She reached across the table and wiped a smudge of chocolate from the corner of my mouth with her thumb. "You're a mess," she said, laughing, her eyes full of simple, uncomplicated affection. I felt like a monster. The gentle, innocent touch of her thumb on my face felt like a brand. I had to force myself to smile, to engage, to be the person she thought I was. I was living a double life, and the two halves were beginning to tear me apart. There was student Liam, the boy who held Chloe's hand and wrote essays about poetic justice. And there was Liam, the adulterer, a man who fucked his professor in the back of a car and was drowning in a sea of lies. I had to create elaborate fictions to explain my absences, late-night study groups, extra shifts at the library, meetings with project partners who didn't exist. My phone became a source of constant anxiety, a bomb that could go off at any moment. A text from Eleanor arriving while Chloe was looking over my shoulder, a call I couldn't answer. The mental energy it took to keep the stories straight, to keep the two worlds from colliding, was utterly exhausting. I was becoming a ghost in my own life, a hollowed-out fraud who could no longer recognize himself in the mirror. Chloe would kiss me, her lips so soft and trusting, and I would feel nothing but the crushing weight of my betrayal. Her love, which should have been my anchor, had become my torture. And the worst part, the sickest part, was that as soon as I left her, the craving for Eleanor would begin again. The addictive pull of the secret, the dark, the forbidden. I was trapped, a willing prisoner in a cage of my own making, caught between a love that felt like sunlight and a passion that felt like a storm. And I was beginning to realize, with a cold, creeping dread, that the storm was winning. The human mind has a frightening capacity for adaptation. In a few short months, the mechanics of my double life had become a grim routine. The lies became smoother, the excuses more practiced. The constant low-grade anxiety had faded into a background hum, a familiar companion to my guilt. I was becoming comfortable on the knife's edge, arrogant even, believing I could balance forever between my two worlds without ever falling. I had forgotten that the sharper the blade, the more catastrophic the slip. The wake-up call came on a quiet Sunday evening. Chloe and I were curled up on the lumpy couch in my dorm room, a textbook open between us, supposedly studying for a midterm. The air was filled with the comfortable, familiar scent of her shampoo and the low drone of a documentary on my laptop. It was a scene of perfect, domestic innocence, a snapshot of the life I was systematically destroying. My phone was on the small table beside the couch. I had grown careless, leaving it in plain sight instead of guarding it like a state secret. It lit up, buzzing softly against the wood. I didn't think anything of it, but Chloe, leaning over to grab her cup of tea, saw the screen. I didn't notice the change at first. It wasn't a gasp or a sudden movement. It was a stillness, a sudden, complete cessation of her presence. The light seemed to go out of her. She just froze, her eyes fixed on the small, glowing rectangle. "Who's E. Vance?" she asked, her voice dangerously quiet, completely devoid of its usual warmth. My blood turned to ice. I felt a cold dread spread through my chest, a physical sensation of being caught. I glanced at the phone. The screen showed a new message. The sender, E. Vance. The preview text was short, 6 simple words. "Be careful. Mark is home early." In that instant, my entire carefully constructed world shattered. The message was ambiguous enough to be explained, but her name, coupled with the warning, it was a death sentence. "Oh," I said, my own voice sounding foreign, distant. "That's just my professor, Dr. Vance." I tried for a casual laugh, but it came out like a strangled cough. "She's just reminding me to be careful with my sources on the final paper." She's a real stickler for plagiarism. The lie was pathetic. It was flimsy and thin, and I could see in Chloe's eyes that she saw right through it. Her gaze shifted from the phone to my face, and her expression was one I had never seen before. It was a look of profound, devastating disappointment. "Your professor texts you on a Sunday night to talk about sources?" she asked, each word a small, sharp piece of ice. "Yeah, she's really dedicated," I said, the words feeling like gravel in my mouth. "She runs a special study group for some of the students in her advanced seminar. It's a big project." "You're not in her advanced seminar, Liam," she stated, her voice flat. She was right. It was a stupid, careless mistake, a detail I had forgotten in my panic. "No, but..." "She invited me to join the study group anyway," I stammered, digging my own grave deeper. "She thinks I have potential." Chloe stood up, a slow, deliberate movement. She wrapped her arms around herself, as if she were suddenly cold. "I'm not an idiot, Liam," she said, her voice trembling now, the cold anger giving way to a raw, wounded pain that was 1,000 times worse. "You think I haven't noticed? You think I don't see the way you disappear for hours? The way you look right through me when I'm talking to you? The way you flinch when I touch you sometimes?" Her voice cracked on the last sentence, and a single tear traced a path down her cheek. It was like a dam had broken. All the little doubts, all the ignored anxieties of the past few months came rushing out in a torrent of pain and accusation. "You're always at the library, always in a study group. You smell different sometimes, like perfume I don't wear. You're hiding something. Just tell me the truth. Please, Liam, just tell me I'm crazy. Tell me I'm being jealous and paranoid and that I have nothing to worry about." She was begging me to lie to her, offering me an escape, a chance to soothe her fears and put the monster back in its cage. And I took it. I stood up and went to her, putting my hands on her shoulders. I looked her straight in the eye, my heart a black, shriveled thing in my chest, and I lied with a conviction that sickened me to my very soul. "You're right," I said, my voice soft, reasonable. "I have been distant. I'm sorry. This project for Vance's class is it's consuming me. I've been under so much pressure and I haven't been handling it well. It has nothing to do with you. You are the only thing that matters to me. There is no one else, I promise." I was gaslighting her, manipulating her love and her trust, turning her valid suspicions into a character flaw. It was the cruelest thing I had ever done. She searched my face, wanting so desperately to believe me. And because she loved me, she did, or she pretended to. She let me hold her, and she cried into my shoulder, apologizing for being suspicious. I held her tight, whispering reassurances, my mind screaming. The victory was ashes in my mouth. We had made up, but the trust between us was gone. I had papered over a canyon, and I knew we were both now terrified to take another step. The moment she left, I grabbed my phone and ran to the bathroom, locking the door behind me. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely type. I sent a frantic, coded email to Eleanor. Emergency. Code red. She saw your name. The reply came back in less than a minute. Go dark. No contact. Delete everything. I'll handle my end. Her panic was a cold mirror of my own. The thrill of our secret was gone, ripped away, and replaced by the stark, ugly reality of consequence. The affair was no longer a passionate escape. It was a liability, a ticking bomb that had almost detonated in the middle of my life. For the next few days, I lived in a state of pure paranoia. Every time Chloe's expression flickered, I was convinced she knew. Every time she picked up my phone to check the time, my heart seized. The world, which had seemed so full of intoxicating possibility, now felt like a prison. The walls were closing in. I felt watched, constantly. The easy intimacy between Chloe and me was replaced by a tense, fragile performance. We were two actors in a play about a happy couple, and we were both forgetting our lines. The close call hadn't just scared me, it had fundamentally changed the game. The abyss I had been dancing around was no longer an abstract concept. I had looked directly into it. I had seen the pain in Chloe's eyes. I had felt the cold terror of Eleanor's panic. And I had felt the sickening rot of my own deceit. I had saved my secret, but I think, in that quiet dorm room, looking into the eyes of the girl I was betraying, I had irrevocably lost my soul. Eleanor's order to go dark plunged my world into a suffocating silence. For 2 weeks, there was nothing. No emails, no late-night texts, no clandestine meetings. In the lecture hall, she was a ghost behind the lectern, her eyes sweeping over my head as if I were an empty chair. The silence was a physical presence, a constant ringing in my ears. At first, it was a relief, a reprieve from the constant, humming anxiety that had become my baseline. My relationship with Chloe stabilized into a fragile, brittle peace. We didn't talk about that night again. It was a wound we were both afraid to touch. But soon, the relief curdled into a new kind of agony. Withdrawal. My body, my mind, had become addicted to the affair's volatile cocktail of risk and passion. And now, deprived of it, I felt a desperate, gnawing emptiness. Every buzz of my phone made my heart leap with a sick, hopeful jolt. Every time I checked my email and found nothing, the emptiness deepened. The passion hadn't cooled. It felt like it was being starved to death, and I was starving with it. When she finally made contact again, it was with a sterile, 2-word email, my office. 4. The reunion was not the desperate, passionate reconciliation I had fantasized about. It was tense and clinical. She looked older, the faint lines around her eyes now etched with a permanent, weary anxiety. The fear from the close call had not subsided. It had taken root and become a part of her. "We have to be smarter," she said, her voice a low, paranoid whisper, even in the safety of her locked office. "We need a new system, a separate email address. We can't use our phones. Meetings have to be far off campus and infrequent." She was no longer a co-conspirator in a passionate crime. She had become its warden, and I was her prisoner. The spontaneity, the exhilarating danger, it was all gone, replaced by a grim, calculated logistics that felt more like planning a covert operation than conducting a love affair. I felt a bitter seed of resentment begin to sprout. I had torched my life, my conscience, my relationship with Chloe. For what? For a series of paranoid, scheduled encounters that felt more like an obligation than a release. But the addiction was too strong. I agreed to her new terms, and our affair lurched back to life, but as a grotesque, zombified version of its former self. The passion was gone, replaced by a desperate, joyless friction. The encounters became less frequent but more sordid. She would choose the locations: anonymous chain motels off desolate highways, miles from campus, places that smelled of bleach and despair. The thrill of the forbidden was gone. replaced by a profound sense of shame. We were no longer star-crossed lovers from a tragic poem. We were just two sad, cheating people in a cheap, dirty room. The unraveling reached its inevitable conclusion on a Tuesday night in a place called the Starlight Motor Inn. The name was a cruel joke. The only star visible was the one flickering and buzzing on its rusted sign. The room she had paid for in cash was a symphony of beige misery. The carpet was stained, the air was thick with the smell of stale cigarettes, and a single fly-blown lamp cast a sickly yellow light on the lumpy bed. She was already there when I arrived, sitting on the edge of the mattress, still in her professional clothes, looking small and out of place. We barely spoke. There was nothing left to say. The intellectual connection that had first drawn me to her was a distant memory. We were here, for one reason, a grim, physical ritual to try and feel something, anything, other than the fear and regret that were consuming us. We undressed in a heavy, awkward silence. The act itself was a desperate, mechanical coupling, devoid of all tenderness. It was no longer about pleasure. It was a frantic, almost violent attempt to recapture a feeling that was long dead. Her body, which I had once worshipped, now felt like the body of a stranger. Her small, pained gasps sounded more like sorrow than ecstasy. There was no connection, no shared release, just the clumsy, frustrating motion of two lonely bodies colliding in the dark. It was the saddest, most desolate feeling I had ever known. Afterward, we lay on our backs on the scratchy polyester comforter, a foot of cold, empty space between us, staring at the water-stained ceiling. The silence in the room was absolute, heavier, and more final than any words could ever be. And in that silence, in that cheap, miserable room, the last vestiges of my fantasy shattered. I turned my head and looked at her. I didn't see the brilliant, captivating professor. I didn't see the passionate, worldly lover. I saw a deeply unhappy, frightened woman who had risked everything and gained nothing. I saw her life, the cold, beautiful house, the absent husband, the career she was terrified of losing, and I realized this affair wasn't an escape for her. It was just another bar on her cage. And I, in my selfish, naive pursuit of a fantasy, had helped her build it. The resentment I had felt toward her vanished, replaced by an overwhelming wave of pity for her and for myself. This wasn't beautiful. This wasn't tragic. It was just pathetic. "I should go," I said into the darkness. "Yes," she replied, her voice flat, lifeless. We dressed in silence, two strangers getting ready to leave a crime scene. There was no kiss goodbye, no promise of a next time. We both knew this was the end. I walked out of the room without looking back, the sound of the door clicking shut behind me, feeling like a period at the end of a long, miserable chapter. As I drove away from the Starlight Motor Inn, leaving its buzzing, broken sign behind me in the darkness, I didn't feel heartbroken. I didn't feel angry. I felt nothing at all. It was a profound, terrifying emptiness, a void where the passion and the guilt and the obsession used to be. The affair hadn't ended with a bang, but with a quiet, whimpering decay. The unraveling was complete. All that was left was the wreckage, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a flicker of a new desire. Not for her, not for Chloe, but for a way out of the ruins of my own life. The end of our affair was not the gut-wrenching, cinematic confrontation I might have written about now. It was a quiet, sterile procedure, like the amputation of a gangrenous limb. A week after that night at the Starlight Motor Inn, I went to her office hours for the last time. We didn't sit. We stood on opposite sides of her desk, the space between us a cold, empty expanse. She told me she had spoken to the department head and was taking a sabbatical for the spring semester. She was going to London with her husband, she said, a chance for them to reconnect. Her voice was steady. Her expression was a carefully constructed mask of professional neutrality. There was no apology, no final confession, just a severance. "I wish you the best in your studies, Liam," she said, the words a formal, final dismissal. I just nodded. A lump of unspoken words lodged in my throat. I turned and walked away, and I never saw her again. The true end, the real consequence, came a week after that. I told Chloe everything. I didn't do it to cleanse my soul or to beg for forgiveness. I did it because the lies had become a cancer, eating away at what was left of me, and I was too exhausted to fight it anymore. We sat in that same dorm room where she had first seen Eleanor's name on my phone. I told her the whole sordid story, my voice a dull, lifeless monotone. She didn't cry, she didn't scream. She just listened, her face growing paler with every word, the beautiful, trusting light in her eyes extinguishing, until there was nothing left but a cold, hard emptiness. When I finished, she was silent for a long time. Then she said, "I hope she was worth it," and she walked out of my life forever. She was right to leave. The boy she had loved no longer existed. He had died somewhere between a professor's bed and a cheap motel room. That was 10 years ago. I live in the city now, in a small apartment that gets the afternoon sun. I became a writer, ironically enough. My novels sell reasonably well. They are quiet, melancholic books about flawed people who make terrible mistakes, people who are haunted by the ghosts of their past decisions. I have never been able to write a simple love story. I have dated, of course, but never for long. It's as if the affair with Eleanor burned out my capacity for simple, uncomplicated affection. I see the potential for betrayal, the dark, complex machinery of desire, lurking beneath every surface. I learned too much, too soon. The knowledge has been a permanent scar on my heart, a constant reminder of the person I became in that single, tumultuous semester. And then, last winter, I was in a bookstore, browsing the poetry section, and I saw it. A new collection, slim and elegant, with a simple, dark blue cover. The author's name was printed in stark white letters, Eleanor Vance. My heart stopped. It felt like a ghost had just whispered my name. My hands trembled as I picked it up. She had done it. She had finally published her own book of poems, the thing she had always dreamed of doing. I paid for it in a daze and took it to a coffee shop, my hands still shaking. I sat down and, with a sense of both dread and reverence, I opened it to the first page. It was a dedication page, and on it, 6 words were printed. 6 words that undid me completely. For Elle, the brightest student who taught me the most painful lesson. I sat there for an hour, staring at that sentence while my coffee went cold. Elle, it was an acknowledgement, a confession, a final, heartbreaking postscript to our story. All those years, I had carried the affair as my own solitary burden, my own secret shame. But in those 6 words, I understood that it had been hers, too. I had not been a simple conquest, a youthful indiscretion. I had been a lesson, a painful one, just as she had been for me. I have never tried to contact her. To do so would be to profane the memory. Our story doesn't belong in the real world of emails and coffee dates. It exists in the past, a perfect, tragic, self-contained narrative. It lives in the memory of moonlight on skin, in the sound of rain on a car roof, in the scent of jasmine and old books. To try and resurrect it would be to kill it forever. So what was it, in the end? Was it love? Or was it just a collision of 2 lonely, desperate people, a boy who craved experience and a woman who craved to feel seen? Was I a pawn in the drama of her unhappy marriage? Or was she the catalyst that forced me into a painful, necessary adulthood? The truth, I think, is that it was all of those things. It was a mistake. It was a gift. It was a wound. It was a lesson. It was the first time, in every sense of the word. Her dedication sits on my desk, a constant, quiet reminder. I read it, and I am once again that 19-year-old boy, standing on the edge of a cliff, about to jump. Eleanor Vance was my professor. She taught me about poetry, about passion, about the beautiful, devastating consequences of a single, forbidden choice. Her greatest lesson was the story of us. It is a sad, beautiful poem that I know, now, I will be reading for the rest of my life.